Caitlin, welcome to Locked In. I think you are our first, is it news reporter or anchor, or what's the exact title?
News reporter's good. Journalist, I'll take.
Journalist, that's better. Yes,
okay, thank you.
That's a better word.
I'm honored. Thanks for having me. Because you've had so many interesting guests. I'm like, how can I sit in this chair? So thank you.
No, we love getting like different perspectives of the criminal justice system from all different, walks of life. And we were just talking about, other interviews we've done that are kind of similar but different. I think this is very different, and it's a hot topic, trending case in Connecticut right now.
It really is. Yeah. So we just came out, and I work with NBC Connecticut, and we just came out with a documentary, and we spent a year doing it, which in local news is rare because, it's kind of news of the day, fast and quick. But yeah, it's called Traces of Doubt, the Forensics of Dr. Henry Lee. And if you live in Connecticut and perhaps across the country, you've heard the name Dr. Lee before.
Yeah, and something that was surprising, I didn't realize it was tied into the wood chipper case too, which is like an infamous, I grew up hearing about that case because everyone would make fun of, don't get put through the wood chipper or this and that.
And as we were driving here, actually, a wood chipper was in front of me, and I was like, is that a sign? But yeah, that was just a horrific case in the 80s. And that's what put Dr. Henry Lee on the map, was the wood chipper. And you've heard of it, but if your viewers haven't, it was the first case in Connecticut that was where there was a murder conviction without finding a body, because a woman's body, as they found out, police found out, and Dr. Henry Lee found out, she went through a wood chipper, unfortunately, and died. So it was a big deal, and that's really what put Dr. Henry Lee on the map as like a famed forensic scientist, and he continued his rise.
Now, how did you get into your current role? Did you always want to aspire to be like that?
It's such a good question. No, I wanted to play college volleyball. I still don't know what I want to do. I feel like that's but yeah, I wanted to play college volleyball and went to college for that. And then I was like, this isn't my career. I'm 6'5". I wish I was 6. I'm 5'6". Like this is, and I did an internship. Okay. And I did an internship at New England Cable News, and it was summer of 2011. And they called us the good luck, bad luck interns because I'm in Boston, I'm behind the scenes, and the Bruins won a Stanley Cup, which was awesome. There was a tornado, Springfield tornado. It hit, which, when does that happen, right? And then there was tons of political news, but the biggest was Whitey Bulger was caught that summer, which, if you're a Boston person, I mean, that's been he's like, it's all the talk. So I worked that summer, and I was like, whoa, this is really interesting and cool. And I love I love people. I feel like your job, right? You don't do the same thing every day. Every day is different, right?
Yeah, I get to talk to people like literally every day. I have an interview almost like every day. It's so cool.
Isn't that cool? And you can and I love that I can help tell like a first draft of history, or I can look into things as I've gotten more involved with my career. It's not just news of the day. Now I'm doing a documentary. Like I can actually look into things now and investigate, and I mostly help consumers a lot too, which is really fun.
Now, do you just do one subject matter like crime, or are you kind of diverse?
Great question. So when I started out, it was news of the day, and I've actually worked in Maine, Utah, and now Connecticut. So I've been all over and covered a lot of things. But now I'm actually our consumer reporter. So it's really rare. Our station has like a hotline, basically a hotline or email. You can email in, and we help people with consumer complaints, because our NBC felt like there was this missing thing. Like you can go out, you can call your state, or you can call this, but like you need someone who can advocate for you. So yeah, that's what I do. I do most of the time, but I'm part of our investigative unit. And when the Ricky Birch and Sean Henning case came up, I said, that should be our next documentary. So I took a little left turn into covering crime for a bit.
Now, do you guys actually read every response? Because I remember when I was going through my stuff with the nightclub back in the day, I was always like putting out press stuff and never really got an answer. Not from like specifically you guys, but from anyone, any news organization.
So I will say we get, oh my gosh, I'd have to delete my emails. Like, when your email box gets full, probably every 3 days.
Really?
Oh, we get so many emails with the consumer hotline. So it's called NBC Connecticut Responds. If you live in Connecticut, we can help you. But we make sure to read everything and respond to everyone. Unless they write like, oh, Caitlin looks terrible today. Because sometimes we get these like unrelated. It's an interesting walk of life. But that's part of the problem is sometimes the news station they're bombarded with. I mean, I literally every 3 days I have to delete my emails.
And do you have a team that makes sure like it's actual newsworthy or?
Yeah. So for folks, I mean, I can kind of like do the basics of a news day. So we have our consumer database. So I'm kind of on that different end. And our investigative team will just kind of work on the bigger things. We're interested, our station's interested, and the town, the community's interested. But usually every morning at a news station, you basically come in and the reporters have been doing their research in the morning while they drink coffee. You kind of are always trying to stay up on it. See if you got any tips, social media, and there's a big morning pitch meeting. And you have these assignment editors and you have producers and managers you kind of all talk and decide, well, what's kind of the most important news of the day? Is it something with weather? Was there crime overnight? It just really depends. Or maybe it's a really fun feature story because we need happy news too. So there's that balance of figuring out what we cover.
Now, how common is it for like an NBC to make like a documentary like you did with this?
Not common at all. It really isn't. Local news, I mean, as you know, you're seeing the podcasting world change. Local news is having to make so much change and adjustment with social media and people not really, turning on their TV at 5 o'clock and having their turkey dinner, right? Like it's a different world. So this was an opportunity of a lifetime to be able to do a documentary. And NBC Connecticut's done three different documentaries. It's super rare. We're owned by NBC, like the fatherhood. We have like this awesome organization. So we're lucky that they let us do this and helped support us. And our bosses that wanted to do it because you don't get this time and opportunity to investigate in this fast-paced TikTok tweeting world. So it was 1 year that I got to spend.
Now, would you consider it like a true crime documentary? Is that the category?
Yeah, I think so. You just finished it. I really do. I think it's true crime and it hits on so many topics. Forensics and the future of forensics, wrongful convictions. And we go through so many famous trials during this case too. And we have the file footage. So we're looking at Dr. Henry Lee's life, this famed forensic scientist, his rise to fame, which was quite spectacular. He's our hometown hero in Connecticut. And then there was a problem. We heard about this case, Ricky Birch and Sean Henning, a wrongful conviction. 2 men spent 30 years in prison for something they didn't do. And when we heard that, we're like, huh. And part of the reason for their wrongful conviction or getting out of prison was because a judge said Dr. Henry Lee said something incorrect during the trial. And the state ended up paying out these guys $25.2 million, 30 years of their lives lost. And that I can remember I'm sitting in our investigative corner and I'm like, wow, this is the famed Dr. Henry Lee. That's for a judge to say he said something incorrect, it's a big deal. And 60 years combined? Prison for something you didn't do. So we just thought back on that and we said, well, let's look at his entirety of his career and have there been other blips on the radar? And that's what we do.
Now, was he actually being interviewed or were those old interviews from a different?
So Dr. Henry, if you read, like the Daily Beast has had a really good article about kind of some of the questions around questionable cases over the years. But no one sat down with him. And my colleague, Len Bestoff, interviewed Dr. Henry Lee 3 times, twice on camera for over an hour and a half each. So it's pretty incredible. And the fact that he did that too. Len Bestoff has kind of a history with Dr. Henry Lee. He interviewed him in North Carolina while he worked there. The staircase murder was happening. It's a pretty famous one. So Len has built kind of I wouldn't say a relationship, but he's gained respect from Dr. Henry Lee. So Dr. Henry Lee sat with Len for 5-6 hours, and we kept going back and questioning him about these cases. And Lee stands by his work, and he tells us he has never made a mistake.
Yeah, most of the true crime docs you see where there is like a wrongful conviction, you never get the guy that made the mistake that put the person behind wrongfully. I was just watching a documentary about the kid that was the football player who got sentenced to prison for like sexual assault or rape, and like the prosecutors were corrupt, the cops were corrupt, and then it ultimately, they didn't end up doing the interview. I think they had the sheriff, but not the prosecutors after he got released and was proved wrongfully convicted.
I'll have to watch that. Wow. Yeah, you don't. And this was like, people were like, wait, what? He did. And that enabled us. We did the first interview, Len did it, and we asked him a bunch of questions mainly about this Ricky Birch and Sean Henning case. And then then he let us come back. So then we could ask him about, we just kept asking him hard questions, and he let us. And I think it's the only time anyone's ever been able to do that with Dr. Henry Lee.
Yeah, something I didn't realize was I thought when those articles came out about the case, because it was in New Milford and the guy's getting released, was that he just worked specifically for the state. But then watching the documentary, he worked for defense teams and the state.
Yeah, all across the country, too. So O.J. Simpson, he was part of O.J.'s defense team. Phil Spector, who's part of that case. Yeah, he even told us, he said he gives his money, what he tells us, Dr. Henry Lee says he gives his money to the University of New Haven. So there's an institute named after him. Cases are taught in, about, he's showing kids, like, this is how you do forensic science. He says he's given $40 million to the university based on the fees from being on all these cases.
So do you, something that stuck out to me, like towards the end, was the theory that how could someone be impartial when they're being paid on a certain, side? What's your opinion through, doing these interviews and finishing the documentary about that?
It doesn't make you think. Like, even I'll rewatch our documentary, and we all have some kind of bias. I mean, as much as we don't want to, in my work, I try to make sure I'm unbiased at all times, but I'm not perfect. And there are studies we learned from the Connecticut Innocence Project. There are studies that if you're asked to do something for the defense or the prosecutors, you're going to probably sway a little bit their way. So I think it's fascinating. I think it makes you think about criminal cases differently, right? Like, now I'm like, and who's the expert, right? There's all these expert witnesses, what is their expertise? I think it makes you think a lot about that.
Even on the law enforcement side, it kind of raises, some thoughts into that, like the cops that are looking to find the bad guy sometimes are they so, straight and narrow, looking to get that one person once they have a suspect in mind that, they go for that no matter the cost.
And I think that's the argument in the Ricky Birch and Sean Henning cases. Basically, they were 17 and 18 years old in the 1980s in New Milford. A guy named Everett Carr his throat slashed. He's stabbed 20 plus times. It's horrific. And I sat down with Ricky for the first time ever since his wrongful conviction and the settlement. And he was like, we were doing bad things. Like, he's so honest and he's such a good guy. He's like, I was doing burglaries. I was stealing stuff. Like, I was, he goes, I think I was just an easy target. To this day, they're actually suing New Milford detectives in a civil suit. New Milford says they did nothing wrong. They said they did everything right. But his argument would be that it's kind of like we were the easy guys to point out. And there was a lot of public pressure. I think you don't think about that either. There's a lot of pressure on forensic scientists and from families. Like, they want justice. But to what end?
Now, when you go through cases of Dr. Lee and you go all the way back in time, do you think that they're all, messed up cases, like he made mistakes? Or do you think that, he started off with the best intentions and then somewhere along, the fame and publicity got to him?
And I think that's the question we let viewers think about when they watch this documentary. So watch it, NBC Connecticut and Peacock. It's coming out on too. But I think it makes you think. Dr. Lee has absolutely done so much for forensic science. He's the godfather of forensic science. Rape kits, as we know it in Connecticut, to collect and help prosecute rapes. They wouldn't be here without Dr. Henry Lee. So he's done so much. But are you perfect? He says he's never, ever made a mistake. We asked him multiple times. He stands behind all of his work. But we found, Ricky Birch and Sean Henning, a judge said he was incorrect. He made an error. And in that case, it's a blood evidence on a towel. So for the Ricky Birch and Sean Henning case, basically the prosecutor said this one towel in the bathroom that had some blood on it was proof that they killed this man, was part of the proof that they killed this man and cleaned up themselves. And the state, the Attorney General's office will even tell you that they say that towel was never tested in a crime lab. Lee says he tested it. He says he sprays chemicals. He says he's testified in court in the 80s that there was blood on it. He stands by his testimony, but it has been ruled that that was never tested.
No, I mean, this is a different time period back then. I feel like there's so many cases, judging just by this interview, where they've just relied on the forensic pathologist or whoever's just testimony because they didn't have those, DNA type kits. So do you think all of these former DNA type cases should be reopened? that were based on just a sole person's testimony?
I think it makes you question. I think this is part of the reason why we did this documentary, because you saw, if you watch it, lawmakers are like, do you open all these up? I'm not the one to make that decision, but I do think it makes you look back. I mean, you're seeing so many, with the science is so different. They used to do bite marks, right? Bite marks used to be like a big thing. That has been told. That's quote unquote what people call junk science. Different hair molecule that they used to be able to like read it, or even blood spatter analysis. Like the National Academy of Science is like, that's just not reliable. So it was a different world. And Dr. Lee does say that. He does say to us, how is it fair to look at a case from 38 years ago and compare it to now? That's the question we leave viewers with.
How hard is it as a journalist to dig into some of these cases, knowing that there were families, affected by it with actual victims and people in these cases, someone had lost a life. So to go back and reopen it and, raise doubt on the person, the suspect that the family has closure with because they went and got locked up for many years. How does that make you feel?
I mean, it's the cases we looked at had either already been questioned, but nonetheless, I always think about the families. I mean, I can't, it's just heartbreaking and horrible for these families for what they've been through. And the fact that these cases may still be questioned 20 years later. The Carr family, now they don't know who killed Everett Carr after Ricky Burch and Sean Henning are released from prison 30 years later. So it's awful. I mean, I try to, when I report stories and news, is just to be like, I'm human. I'm like, we're all the same, and I try to remember that when I do reporting.
No,
like when you do your interviews, right? You're like, I'm just the same as you,
Yeah, and you kind of have to stay like neutral. People ask me why I interview certain people, and everyone has a story to share. And they're either on the wrong side of it, in the middle of it, or on the good side of it. And you kind of like to hear all the different perspectives through that person's lens. I literally,
sorry, mom and dad, but I have that tattoo. Everyone has a story. And the rest of the quote is, have the patience to listen and the wisdom to change, right? Have the patience to listen, something like that. But that, to me, is like key. And that's why I'm like, I hope there's a lot of, media reporters, this, and I just hope I can help people in some way, or bring light to something, or give hope to someone too that might not have had it, or might not have had a voice. And I think with this documentary, that was really important. We hadn't heard from Ricky Burch or Sean Henning. These guys just spent 30 years in prison for something they didn't do. And we're glad and thankful that they took the time to share their story, because they don't want it to happen to anyone else.
Yeah. What's their demeanor? Someone that's been in prison for that long and then finds out they were wrongfully convicted. Well, they knew they were wrongfully convicted, but the world finds out. What's that like, being in the same room as them and interviewing them?
And before we started interviewing, it wasn't an easy task. It wasn't easy to get Ricky. It took a couple, 6, 7, 8 months to build trust, because I was like, I swear I'm not trying to, who do you trust after being in prison for 30 years for something you didn't do? I don't blame him. So I was like, it's not live, you can start over, you can do it. But he walked into the room, and I'm just such a nice guy. And I don't know, I think about that interview all the time, goosebumps, because he said something to the effect of like, it's the opportunities they took. He spent all of his adult life in prison, can't have kids now. It was really emotional. But he and Sean both said they wanted to share their story with us, just to make sure there's more checks and balances in place in the future.
Do you think when someone like Henry Lee, sees their interviews, that might change his opinion on some of his actions? Like, do you think that he is capable of feeling emotion for that? Because anyone that watches that feels, emotion for what these individuals went through.
I'd be interested. We haven't heard from Dr. Henry Lee since this aired. Yeah, and we did ask him. We said, what would you say to Ricky Burch, if he was sitting here? What would you say to Sean Henning? And he, pretty emotionless. And he just says, it wasn't, I didn't convict them. I didn't make any mistakes. So I don't know. I don't know if you can change someone, but I'm glad we could let their voices be heard.
What about the law enforcement perspective of this? Did you guys reach out to like the New Milford Police Department, and did they want to do it, or why did they not want to do it?
So we didn't, for that case, we reached out to them, but more so for the, for their reaction. And there's a lawsuit underway still. Ricky Birch and Sean Henning have a lawsuit against New Milford and police detectives. But we didn't, you could have done a whole documentary on Ricky and Sean's case and their experience and the car murder. But we really wanted to focus on Dr. Henry Lee. So we, for those who watch it, you'll see like the rise of Dr. Henry Lee, O.J. Simpson case. We just really go through his timeline, and we didn't, as much as we would want to talk to more people, we kind of wanted to stay in the Dr. Henry Lee. He's our hometown hero. We wanted to take a look at his past.
So what exactly is was his job title and description, and was that common to use individuals like that back in the day?
It's a really good question. So he came from Taiwan in the 60s. He went to police school there. He said he went there it was free. So it made sense to someone with humble, who didn't have a lot of money in Taiwan, became the youngest police captain there. It's really quite a story. And then came to the U.S., went to college here. And it was quite the American dream, right? Like all of a sudden he's now at the University of New Haven. He becomes the chief in the 70s. He becomes Connecticut's chief forensics lab chief. He was that for decades, and then later becomes the public safety commissioner too. So he had huge roles here. We have always had those roles. Has it always been a forensic scientist? No, right? It's just it's fascinating.
So he eventually leaves public service then to go into private practice?
So even while he's in public service, we found he was still, like O.J. Simpson was 93, Phil Spector case was 03-ish, like around those timelines. So even during his public service, he was being he was the consultant for cases.
That wasn't a conflict of interest or anything? He was allowed to be hired
That's
for that?
a great question. That's something as we're doing it, you kind of see the timeline, and you're like, even during some of his service here, he had a television show, Trace Evidence, that was on Court TV, which I think is a really interesting part. We have some of that in our documentary.
I saw that. It seemed very kind of corny a little bit, too, at what he was doing, like that show. Not the documentary, but that show.
Thank you.
No, his show, just like the reenactments and walking through it.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
And we got I went to Louisiana to interview a man convicted of murdering his wife. And he's adamant to this day he didn't do it. Henry Lee was brought in to look at this case. It had been a hung jury, and this man's friend had been initially charged. And now, instead of being the star witness, the husband is now also a co-defendant. So he really thinks when Henry Lee was brought in, his fate changed. And there's an episode. Dr. Henry Lee has an episode of how he says he solved that crime. So we showed it to Carrie Myers. We showed it to this man convicted of murder who's now out of prison. And that was quite the reaction. So for folks, if you watch our documentary, it must be hard to see how someone portrays what happened that night.
Yeah, because Henry Lee kind of, contradicts himself, because he said he didn't really know much about the case and he was just there to give like the expert testimony. And now he's saying that there was a laundry basket and this and that was used in the killings. It changed up quickly. But it also goes to the theory of like he kind of sold out for, in this day and age, they'd call it like views or publicity.
And I think that's how Carrie Myers saw it, for sure. It was just like, wait, how? This wasn't what happened. But yeah, they both stand by their stories. And that's why we're like, we really just want to show this to viewers, show them kind of all what existed in one package of Dr. Henry Lee's life and legacy.
Do you think as a journalist, you're able to sit down with someone and know that they're actually innocent after telling their story? Like, do you know guilty from innocent just by talking to someone?
No, I feel like that would be, no.
Some prison guards, like, will say that they have, like, kind of that sense. Like, if someone is really actually innocent, they kind of just know, You get to see the character of a person and learn more. And as a journalist, you're really diving into their story.
Yeah, I think if I could, with this one, we spent so much time with so many cases. It wasn't like I was just with one person. I think that would be different for sure. I don't have that sixth sense. Definitely not.
And Carrie, who was the male in that, what's it like being around him after, he served 30 years for killing his wife, or allegedly killing his wife, which he was found that he didn't do. But what's like the I guess the aura being around him and in the community when you were there too?
Yeah, so Kerry actually was convicted of killing his wife, and he was commuted. So that's why I got to meet him. He was out of prison. He was commuted. He stands by that he didn't do it. He's actually with the Louisiana Parole Project now. So that was really interesting. So he says, he's adamant he didn't kill his wife. He was convicted of killing her. But now he helps other people in situations like he was in prison, long sentences. So we were with him for a little bit, and it was cool to see his work and how he's helping other people. Like they provide free advocacy and legal work, and they help people when they get out of prison for housing and stuff.
So do you think anyone will, or has anyone come out and say like this is actually like deliberate of what he's done, Dr. Henry Lee? Has anyone come out and done that yet? And what will be the ramifications from that?
No one's come out and said, and he stands by his work, like I said. There has been studies, the National Institute of Justice. We actually spoke with John Morgan, who's this engineer who studied all these wrongful convictions for the National Institute of Justice. And I think that is more of what we're seeing now, is kind of looking back at wrongful convictions. What went wrong? Was it, he went through like an engineer would, and was it bias? Was it purposeful mistakes? And his take is that Henry Lee, it wasn't a purposeful error, but maybe he didn't, how did he say it? Maybe he got a little ahead of himself, a little too big for his britches, perhaps really believed in his theory. That was John Morgan's take. So I think we're seeing that with the Innocence Project. Don't you think of kind of like going back, looking at what was wrong, and hopefully what can be done better in the future?
What do you think about the withholding evidence accusations that were in some of those cases? I noticed that was kind of a common theme. Yeah,
that really was. And obviously, in some cases, those police officers aren't even alive anymore, or those were part of the civil lawsuit. I think it's interesting. We didn't dig necessarily into if it was true, if it wasn't true. And it's hard because these cases were from the 80s. It's not like they had computers. That was probably the biggest thing here. I was even like, even reporting back then would have been different. No cell phones. So one day we were in Danbury at the Historical Society, like going through like the old school newspapers just to like figure out what happened. So I think that's a lot of it too. It's not like the case files are electronic and with all the details and, that kind of thing.
How hard is it to go back into these, police stations and courthouses and get documents from cases from the 80s or the 90s when there wasn't as, technology as it is today?
It's a bit of a challenge. It's like a scavenger hunt. It's a scavenger hunt. And then you're like, it's hard to hunt down. You're trying to figure out what court the case was prosecuted in, but it might have moved to a habeas court because there was a prison, they were in prison and trying to get out. So it's like a scavenger hunt, and you're like, it's just in paper boxes, like all of this important stuff to someone's life, their future is in these boxes. So it was hard. We ended up finding a lot of evidence. We saw evidence that a lot of people haven't seen before, and we're able to get footage of that. But it's not like it's perfectly computerized whatsoever. We were going through boxes and they're like dusty, but it's fascinating. There was even some of the court boxes we found like Sean Henning's own personal notes, like during trial, of like his thoughts he was having. Like, I didn't, like this isn't correct or whatever. It was really eye-opening and cool. So you can do it. It just takes work.
Do you ever find that evidence is missing, like, or got lost or anything when you go and inquire about some of these cases?
In doing this project, sometimes it's hard. It was just hard to find stuff, or like some boxes would be here, but where was the rest of it? So yeah, we're still to this day, in one case in particular, we want to look at this notebook and it's sealed somewhere. So we're going to keep fighting and looking for it. But yeah, definitely we didn't see everything, but at some point you just got to keep moving on.
Now, does anyone in the public have access to this kind of evidence, or is it just because you're a journalist?
That's a good question. I think they're public record. I do. I think, like you can FOIA things and you can ask to see things. So I think you just have to know your rights and know the public access laws, and you should be able to.
Also, on the topic of evidence, I thought it was very strange that Dr. Henry Lee just had the acrylic nails, and he was supposed to like ship them to the defense team, or which could have been like a smoking gun in the case. Is that normal?
I don't think. Yeah, that whole case. So if you're going to watch our documentary, please do, because this is really, it's the Phil Spector case. Okay. Like, this guy's Phil Spector, right? Like, music producer to the celebrities, Beatles. So that is a big, so it's a fingernail, a missing part of this woman's fingernail is a big part of that case. And Dr. Lee's, his reputation's questioned because of this piece of evidence. He says he didn't pick it up. Someone said they saw him pick it up. So we kind of show that through history and a lot of file footage and how he says he wanted to ship it.
Is Dr. Henry Lee still practicing? Like, is he still active in his role?
He's incredibly active still. He's 86 years old at the time we spoke with him. He says he gets up every morning, kind of works out. He gets up early. He lectures still, and there's still an institute at the University of New Haven in his name.
I wonder how it's going to affect if he can even do another trial or cases, because when you have something like this out there, it kind of taints the jury pool. That's
a great question. And from my understanding, I think he's kind of retired in that aspect. But he's written dozens of books, papers, and continues to lecture.
How is his character when you were talking to him or even seeing the stuff that didn't make it into the documentary? Do you think he's likable to if you were on a jury, would you find him likable and trustworthy and believable?
So that's the number one thing we heard from you. We went back and looked at old juror interviews from all these cases we looked at, and people think he's he's really entertaining, really gregarious. He's really engaging. He makes a lot of jokes. He really a likable person on the stand from what we heard.
Oh, so you actually got to see the jury interviews
here and there. So we went back through the perk of doing this as an NBC employee was the file footage, there's just file footage for days. So we would go through all these different interviews, and we would go through every news story for all of these cases and just see. And at some of them, the jurors do speak. So, in one I can remember saying, yeah, he was so entertaining, and it was fascinating.
Did you see any of why they convicted or why they were on the edge in any of these cases?
Yeah, and I think in the few of the cases you'll hear from the juror, the Phil Spector case is one of them. You'll hear from the jurors, one of the jurors. Yeah, I think it just every case is different depending on what they heard, what they saw, who they believed. And people put so much weight on forensic science. And I think that's something we learned during this documentary too. Jury, people love evidence. They want to know, they want to see it, hear it, believe it. And that's why I think Dr. Henry Lee became so fascinating to people. It's like the crime, that CSI era, right? We love that. We want to see it. We want to see things happen fast. It's not necessarily how it works, but he helped open people's eyes to forensic science.
Have you ever been on a jury before?
I haven't. I don't think they'd ever let me.
Yeah, I feel like you would be great on one. The defense would want you because you're a journalist, but you're right. I don't think they would let you.
I don't think they would ever let. I've done jury duty once, and I didn't even get through the door. I feel like they'd be like, and I, I'm always following what's going on, right? They don't want you to know about the case at hand.
That is true. So when you pulled up old records at NBC and stuff, did they have all the the news reportings for back then? Because NBC has been around for forever. Do they have that stored?
Yeah, I think that's one of the coolest parts about this documentary. And you were so nice to say you've watched it, so thank you.
No, it is good, and we'll have the description in it.
I appreciate that.
And it'll be even better on Hulu.
Thank you.
Or Peacock.
Sorry, thank you. No,
yeah.
Maybe Hulu too one day.
Yeah.
But I think that because evidence was so hard to find, track down, 80 years, it's from the 80s, having all this file footage is really helpful to you get to live, see what it was like back then to now visually. It's really cool.
Now, I think it was two of these cases, the Connecticut Innocence Project actually picked them up and helped to free these individuals. Can you tell us about that, how they pick up a case or what information there is about that?
You know what? I don't know too much about their process, but I do know that they're selective because I'm sure they have everyone and their mother reaching out, for that help. I know they're pretty selective, and when they do stand by someone, they work for years. So for the Ricky Burt Sean Henning case, years to help there's the legal system is not very fast, as we all know. So they work for years to help these folks.
No, I'm assuming you've never went to prison before or never been arrested or anything like that.
No.
So as a, someone looking at all of this information and these stories and facts, how does it make you feel? What have you learned about the criminal justice system?
Well, even just for my reporting for 15 years now, I'm always just like that. I feel like so much of how people get into trouble, quote unquote, or it's like circumstantial, right? Like that could have been me if I went left instead of right one day, right? Like could have been, it could be my family member, it could be my brother. When I was in Maine, I did a whole interview. I sat with women because women inmate population has skyrocketed over the years, and just like it was like, you could have a back injury and you take one pill to make you feel better, and then next thing you know, you're one of these women I interviewed. So I always, it could be me or it could be you. Like that's how I always feel, and I hope it comes off that way when I tell a story, because it could be me, it could be our loved ones.
You've gone into prisons before as a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever feel like it's staged? Like you're not getting the real
I've heard
answer?
you ask this before.
Yeah. Now I'm going to the source.
Yeah, no, you're right. I went into the women's prison in Maine like 10 years ago. I don't know. And I was a younger journalist too, so I wasn't like probably as bold. And but my interviews were not. I was it was just like I went into a room and it was just like whoever wanted to talk to me. They were pretty good about that, but wasn't this big federal facility or anything like that. But It was really, really lovely people I met there, and they wanted to share their stories. Like one was like, I had this happened to me. I was this, So that didn't feel staged to me.
It's a tough walking out of there, like after hearing those stories. Like when I interview people inside a facility and, and I know I was in their shoes before, and then leaving them, it's tough.
Yeah, you like wanted to, yeah, like hug them. You were like, wow, the one lady with the back injury turned down a whole new road. You're like, man, you just want to hug her.
Yeah,
they were nice.
I watched the 60 Minutes one on federal prison, and that just seemed like a little bit, I don't know, staged. And some of the inmates even said after, there was like TikTok clips about saying that they were told that they had to say certain things.
Oh, that's unfortunate. I mean, then why do the story, right?
Yeah, that's true. And then whenever like there were celebrities that came to prison, like I was in prison with, what's his name? The guy that was a part of Trump's team or whatever, George Papadopoulos. Like everything's different when they come for like those 2 weeks.
Well, that's why it's really cool you and the folks you bring on. Like everyone's bringing a different perspective to know what it's really like when the cameras aren't there or whatnot. But I think this documentary, we really get like Dr. Henry Lee, the man, the myth, the legend in a chair for hours. I think is really something you're not going to see anywhere else.
So now when you interview, like you take just a story of a crime case or whatever, are you thinking that this person might not actually be guilty, or they could be innocent? Are you looking at your journalism in a different way now, maybe with a little more skepticism?
I think it opens your eyes to everything. I think as the court, this will help me covering crime cases in the future. Just by I have kind of the questions to ask, or what I think it all opens your eyes to ask more questions. Definitely.
When you sat down with these individuals, did you research each individual case, or are you kind of like going where the conversation goes and seeing?
Tons of research. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Like I'm not an expert in anything. I just am good at Googling and so tons and tons of research. And then I feel like you're good at it. Like I go like where the questioning, make sure I hit the 4 questions I want to get, but kind of just go where the questioning goes. And I think with Ricky Birch, for example, I did that. And I asked him so many times if he was angry about his wrongful conviction. And he kept saying, it's not worth it. But I think one of the most interesting things that came out of our interview was, because I was like, well, what do you want justice? Like, what do you want? And he was just like, I want those who wronged me. And it was so interesting to hear. He said, it would be nice for them to do 30 days behind prison. Just 30 days, he said, because the horror he left with. He's like, you're looking over your shoulder all the time. But that wasn't like it. That question kind of came out of nowhere. And I was like, wow, it was so powerful. 30 days. He did 30 years.
And he was in the Connecticut facilities?
And also out of state, too.
Oh, they moved him out of state, too. Mm-hmm. Were they together in their stay?
They were together for a little bit. Sean Henning, within their beginning of their stay, he tells us, we didn't get into this in the documentary, but he was stabbed through his chest. And Ricky was there for that and saw that, and it's really bad. I think they'd be great on the show. You got to get involved because I think you could really get into their stay and their time.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's been asking for like a wrongfully convicted, case. So far, this is as close as we're getting, because people are hesitant, and it's their story, and this is a new world. Imagine going to prison 30 years ago, coming out, and now there's podcasts, there's true crime documentaries, there's everything.
Sean was telling, and it's totally their stories to tell, but just like a little anecdote was, you get out of prison, you get handed a cell phone. There was no cell phones in the 80s when they went in, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's a totally different podcast.
Now, are you a true crime fan to begin with, or is this the world kind of like new to you?
I am. I do. I really like it, but when I leave work, I try to I need to set boundaries because it's a lot of news, a lot of, TV news. So yeah, I need to set boundaries for myself. So I'm more of a sports gal after work.
When you look at like these crime scene photos and some of it, they blur out because they're pretty gruesome. How does that make you feel when you look at these? It's
really sad. I'm glad they exist, so we can see the extent of what had happened, right? And we can show folks and blur things out. But hopefully, it's horrible. But hopefully, it helps tell history in a way so it doesn't get repeated.
Yeah. Now, when you're sitting down, are you a part of the editing process of this documentary? Like when you're interviewing, obviously not every interview. Not every minute of it makes it in. You have to take a piece from one to go counter another. What's that process like?
I think we had for the documentary it ends up being it's 7 sections and it ends up being about an hour. But I think we had 20 hours.
20 hours.
Yeah, I want to say, I remember on our editor, there were an 8-person team who did this, and our editor had, I think, at least 20 hours. At least. Because, there's B-roll and interviews and... so we kind of all split it up as a team and wrote parts, and that was the hardest part, is figuring out how to tell a story, how it's interesting, what's going to be how is it going to leave viewers thinking, and we have an editor to do the editing because I couldn't do that. Not like that. He's amazing.
Yeah, I was thinking about it earlier. This format's easy, but the actual, putting the pieces of this person saying this, and you have this interview, and you have to mesh that together and figure out how it flows.
And for some of the shoots, we'd have because we just wanted to make it look interesting and beautiful, and there might be 6 cameras on one person. So imagine editing with 6 different camera views. It's really cool, but it's a feat I couldn't do.
Now, where were the locations that you filmed? I know you went out of state for it, but when you were filming locally, was that at these individuals' houses?
So Dr. Henry Lee, we interviewed him at the Institute. So when you watch our documentary, you'll see we're in his Institute's kind of common space, and there's pictures of him and all over the wall. Ricky Birch, we found kind of just a mutual, just kind of a generic spot, So you want someone to be comfortable, especially when this, it took a while for him to want to talk. And then he's like, you know what, I do want to share, but I wasn't going to do it at his house. We can, you don't have to. And then the other interviews, a lot of them, Innocence Project was New York. I was in Carrie Meyer's house in Louisiana. So if people are comfortable doing it, it's a nice place to do an interview because it's your home.
Was that the same house that the murder had happened in? No. Okay. Now, what about the ramifications and the backlash from the documentary on Henry Lee? Have you seen anything new kind of pop out? Any else open up the floodgates?
We've heard from a few. We've heard from folks who allege that perhaps there were issues with their case. So we're looking into those, but nothing from Dr. Henry Lee yet. And a lot of people just have left with a lot of they want to talk about it more with us. So I think it leaves a lot of questions about forensics in the future, and I hope it leaves people thinking, asking more questions, and maybe being more thoughtful. It has changed me.
What do you think the biggest questions are that you've gotten about it that have been unanswered so far?
I think the one question you asked is the one, do you reopen? It's one our lawmakers have asked, do you continue to reopen cases? To what end? And then the other question is, well, what do you do moving forward? How do you trust experts, or how do you, So I think there's kind of the past and the future. And John Morgan, who did that survey for the National Academy of Sciences, he thinks there should be more checks and balances, like more of a forensic, like each state should have more of a board that kind of checks each other, since every state really differs.
Yeah. Do you think Dr. Henry Lee knew going into this documentary that it was kind of like, anti him in a way, like it was being shaped to show that he did something wrong? Did he understand that?
Well, we went into it telling him we were going to ask him really tough questions. Like we weren't just going to and we wanted to hear about his life and his and the good things he's done too. But he knew we did when Best Off was, we're going to ask you these really tough questions about these cases that you've been questioned about. And he gave us the time. And you never see him speak like this we haven't before to anyone else.
As a journalist, why do you think, what's the psychology behind individuals that, when the documentary is about them in a negative way, why do you think they come and talk to you? Because you do see this, like murderers agreeing to do, interviews on true crime series and this and that. There's something about them that makes them want to do it.
I'm no psychologist. I have no idea, but people want to tell their side of the story, and we wanted to show both. So I'm glad he did. I'm glad people can see both sides, because I think you're going to leave really seeing both sides, and it's interesting.
When you do like crime in general stories, does your family ever like give you backlash or anything like that, or ask you questions about it? Like, how do you stay neutral and this and that? What's your opinion?
Yeah, they do. They're really supportive, and they. This one was a big task to, you're questioning a hometown hero, right? So there was a lot of conversations, a lot of teamwork. Our team it was a lot of teamwork. You can really talk about it, though, actually. We didn't really want to talk about it. I didn't really talk about it to anybody. It was pretty secret even in our newsroom, just because we didn't want the word to get out that we were doing this, because we worked so hard to get these interviews with Mr. Birch and Mr. Henning. So it was really secretive for a while. We just didn't want it to get out and someone else beat us to it.
Now, do you think he's done more harm than good, or more good than harm, knowing everything you know now?
I think the viewer will have to make that decision.
Yeah,
I'm the unbiased journalist. I think we put everything out there, and I think you'll see for yourself what you think.
Now, do you think there's more people like him out in the world and in different states?
You know what? Do you know of any other forensic scientists that have been talked about? Or there was a few.
Famous.
There was a Herbert McDonald. There was a few that kind of were in his sphere. Not that I'm aware of, and I'd be interested to know.
Yeah.
If you know anyone, if anyone's watching, if there was someone who had this kind of clout.
So when you spent a year working on this, are you working on any other projects, or it's just that, they eat, sleep, live it day and night?
It was we still had to be on TV a couple times a week doing consumer stories. So I would be like, doing this Dr. Lee crime, and then I'd be like trying to help someone get their money back for airport or this or travel stuff. So it was a lot of compartmentalization, but it was good. Yeah, we still had to be on TV.
Yeah. And where do you go from this? Like after this documentary, you spent a year working on it. What's next? Do you guys do a follow-up to this at all? Is that
I think that the possibilities are definitely endless. Like I said, we've heard from people. If there's the new Milford, there's still a civil lawsuit going on with Ricky Birch and Sean Henning's case. So there's still more to it. And perhaps there'll be an episode 8, 9, or 10. So.
Yeah. And maybe if more come out of the woodwork, more stories.
It'll be interesting to see. We haven't at this point heard any, haven't heard of any that are making legal steps like this, but if they are, we'll be sure to follow up.
How did you decide which ones were going to make it into the documentary, or were those the only cases that were subject to scrutiny that you guys could prove?
At this point, those were the ones that were subject to scrutiny. Okay. So we said, these ones have had questions, so we're going to focus on those.
Do you know how many cases he's gotten convictions of in general? Do you know what those stats are?
I don't know what his. So he's got he's helped put people in prison rightfully. He's helped people avoid prison for sure. I don't know the numbers, but he said he has touched 8,000 to 10,000 cases in his career.
Wow,
it's a lot.
Imagine being the person that has to go and look through that and all of that.
No, yeah, I think it's an interesting feat and an interesting question that even our Connecticut lawmakers were like, are we going to have to go back? And, is it just a couple of cases out of 10,000? I don't know.
Are any of the attorneys still alive today from any of these cases, the defense attorneys?
Yeah, for Ricky Birch and Sean Henning, because that case is still continuous with New Milford. They're still here and around to tell the story. The wood chipper prosecutor, we sat down with him after this famous case. We heard how that court case happened. So yeah, there was still a lot. It's really fascinating people.
Yeah, the lawyer interviews are always really interesting because they have such a different perspective. And then also the ones that are like wrongfully convicted cases too. I love hearing that perspective in documentaries and true crime ones. Couldn't you listen to their stories all day? Because it's like the little nuggets you don't see on. Even reading trial transcript or something. It's just there's just so much that you can't usually share in a 1.5 minute news story, right? Like that's usually on the news. It's like a quick blip. So this was to be able to dig into all this and look through for a documentary was really special. And I agree, those interviews with lawyers are so cool. Now, do you feel like the press and journalism is fair to people that are, getting charged and arrested?
I figured you'd ask this question, and I've been thinking about it a lot. I think there's the term media too is so weaponized, right? But it's so hard. We're local news, and I think local news we want to cover the local. We want to cover what's important to people in town, and I know from our station's perspective, we are we have managers read our stories, so they make sure they have both sides of the stories. We have lawyers who are reading our stories when they get to that point for that much scrutiny. So I hope we're doing the best of our ability. Can I speak for all journalists? There's always some bad apples, right? So unfortunately, like in any business.
And are you guys always reaching out for both sides when you do that type of case?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Always. Mm-hmm.
Now, why do you think that there's not follow-up articles done about the people that have changed their life? Or do you think that's just not newsworthy, or there's just too many of them?
And I think there should be more. I think it's a good point. I think so often in small local news, there's only so many reporters. There's the big stories of the day. You want to get people what they need to know, and then you move on. But I think if you hear more from the folks in the aftermath, it would be awesome too. Could we do a better job of keeping, that interview I did from 6 years ago? Are they, it would be great to hear from them. We could probably do a better job. It's just such a fast-paced world. So I think it's a little bit of both. I think we could do better, but it would be great to hear from people more. You have social media, TikTok, write to us, let us know.
Yeah, it is a lot too to keep track of and handle that. I get that perspective.
Even in this, we still have a calendar of following the court cases, and things get moved and there's continuances. Just following one case is hard enough, but I think we could all do better at it. And I think if people wanted to tell their story too, we're open to hear their pitches. Send us an email.
Has there ever been talk about in the journalism world about not publishing stories related to crime so it doesn't say taint a jury pool or anything like that local in the area?
Not necessarily the story itself, but I know NBC, for example, we have this new policy where we're not necessarily putting mugshots out there to put mugshots out there, booking photos. And that's a newer thing because what if you didn't do it, right? Then that picture lives. So that's something we're really cool conversations in our newsroom every day of maybe if this is the person, we might put a booking photo out there. If it's someone who's maybe it's an Amber Alert and they have perhaps are accused of kidnapping someone. Okay, we're on the lookout for this person. But if not, we really don't use booking photos at all anymore for that reason. Because what if you didn't do it? You're just accused at that point. So that's a little bit of a change.
Yeah, it is interesting. And on the topic of those photos that they put out, looking for someone, I was interviewing a bank robber the other day, and he was saying that the photos that the police gave the news were a lot grainier than the ones that they actually had. Kind of like a ruse that, that they actually knew who they were looking for, but they gave him a grainier photo to put out into the news. And it was an interesting thing when he saw the actual files. The bank camera footage wasn't as grainy as it was made out to be in the news reporting.
Interesting. Well, and technology does keep getting better and better, and CCTV. So we do think about. I think we have conversations about what does go out there and what doesn't. and what viewers need to see, should see, want to see. Like, when do you cut a clip before it's too much?
Yeah. Do you ever go back to a case that you've talked about and wrote about or reported on to see where that person went or happened? And it could be crime, not crime, anything in general.
Yeah. Crime, or even sometimes you'll like see them pop up somewhere else, and it's fun. Yeah, I do. I wonder what people are doing after I've interviewed them.
Is it hard to remember everyone like by name, or do you just kind of like you do hundreds of interviews?
Probably like you know, some of them stick with you more than others.
Yeah,
for sure. There was one guy, I was just looking him up yesterday. When I was in Maine, I covered called the North Pond Hermit is what his case became. But for 27 years, he lived in the woods alone, and he survived off of burglarizing folks' house in the wintertime. So like for 27 years, he lived in the woods. And I always wonder what he's doing right now. He likes to be by himself, of course. So, but things like that I do think about.
Have you reached out to him, or does he reach out to you?
I haven't, and I didn't get too close to that one. No, gosh, I did. I think I wrote him a couple letters though back in the day. But
what do you think is the biggest misconception the public has about journalists, news stations, news reporting in general?
I think it's that we just do it for the headline, or we do it for the salaciousness of the story. And that sure ain't the case for me anyway. Like, it's the people. And it's like I said, like, it could be me on the other side. And I think that's the biggest misconception, that it's just like we're doing it to be, for that. It's not the case.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, being on both sides of it, like being the target of like a salacious headline and now being the person that has to make kind of like salacious headlines to drive traction in the story, I get it. Like I understood why I was headlined certain ways when news stations were reporting on me. And it goes back to what you were saying about what he had said about, spending 30 days in jail. They should walk a mile in their shoes and what they went through. And I think that's just, such a common theme of, you got to understand what that person's went through, whether it's in your line of work or my line of work or anything.
Humanity, right? Like, we're all human at the end of the day. So I appreciate what you're doing, and thank you for letting us talk about our documentary.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can be insightful for some people, and maybe you'll have a different thought about the news.
Yeah, well, hopefully it drives some traction to it. And thank you, Caitlin, for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Awesome conversation. You're the best.
Thank you.